The 19th plenary meeting of the 11th emergency special session of the General Assembly is called to order. Before proceeding further, I would like to remind members that all meeting participants are encouraged to consider wearing a mask while indoors, including in the General Assembly Hall and in conference rooms. The General Assembly will continue its consideration of Agenda Item 5. We shall now proceed to consider draft resolution A/ES11/L7 and draft amendments A/ES11/L8 and A/ES11/L9. Before proceeding further, I would like to inform members that the draft resolution and draft amendments have closed for e-sponsorship. I now give the floor to the representative of the Secretariat.
Mr. President, I will address the additional co-sponsorship for all three L documents. First, for L7. I should like to announce that since the submission of the draft resolution and in addition to the delegations listed on the L document, the following countries have also become co-sponsors of A/ES11/L7. Antigua and Barbuda, Belize, Cabo Verde, Chile, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Jamaica, Myanmar, Niger, Papua New Guinea, Peru, Samoa, Singapore, Suriname, Tonga, Trinidad and Tobago, Uruguay, and Vanuatu. If any other countries wish to co-sponsor A/ES11/L7, please signify by pressing the microphone button. I see none. Next, I will go to L8. I should like to announce that since the submission of the draft amendment, in addition to the delegations listed on the L document, the following country has also become co-sponsor of A/ES11/L8, Nicaragua. If any other countries wish to co-sponsor A/ES11/L8, please signify by pressing the microphone button. I see none. Finally, for L9, since the submission of the draft amendment and in addition to the delegation listed on the L document, the following country has also become co-sponsor of A/ES11/L9, Nicaragua. If any other countries wish to co-sponsor A/ES11/L9, please signify by pressing the microphone button now. I see none. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Secretariat. Delegations wishing to make a statement in explanation of vote before the vote on any of the proposals under this item, including proposed amendments, are invited to do so now in one intervention. Before giving the floor for explanation of vote before the vote, may I remind delegations that explanation of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Djibouti.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, President. President, we would have liked today's vote to be on a resolution celebrating the end of a war and the beginning of lasting peace. Quite the contrary, we are seeing a continued deterioration in the security situation, an intensification of conflict and violence, which is becoming ever more brutal given the warlike rhetoric we are hearing. This scenario is further darkened by the threat of the use of nuclear weapons and the probability of nuclear accidents. We were shocked and bewildered regarding the reasons behind the war, and A year on, we are still confused about the reasons for its continuation, without a clear perspective for an exit to the crisis, either through direct negotiation or the mediation of a third party. Peace has become a controversial notion and coloured by suspicions. During this extraordinary session today, our resolution aims to clarify the way to reach a just, lasting and comprehensive peace, and this deserves our support. Despite these dark horizons, we must never abandon. We must work tirelessly to promote just and lasting peace upon the basis of the United Nations Charter and international law. Violence must give way to dialogue and diplomacy.
International peace and security can only be achieved by the compliance of all states with their obligations under the UN Charter. Chief among these are the obligations to respect the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of other states as inscribed in Article 2.4, and to refrain from the threat or use of force. Wars of aggression cannot be tolerated, nor can efforts to acquire territory or change borders by force of arms. All such flagrant violations of basic international norms must be called out, denounced, resisted, and opposed by all law-abiding states. Djibouti did it 1 year ago, and we are doing it again today. There can be no fatigue when it comes to violations of the Charter and other fundamental breaches of the international order. This is the reason why Djibouti will vote in favor of the draft resolution before us today. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Djibouti. Merci, monsieur. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nigeria.
Mr. President, the global community has in the recent past endured many disasters, the most acute ones being in Ukraine, Pakistan, Turkey, and Syria. The causes and the remedies vary, yet all have been accompanied by loss of thousands of lives, properties, and displacement. Many countries, entities, and individuals have stepped up in support of human beings who found themselves in these conditions. This is the kind of solidarity that the United Nations advocates for, provides, and organizes. Nigeria continues to express concerns over the ongoing war against Ukraine and regrets the inability of the international community to broker peace between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, both of whom are members of this assembly. The humanitarian crisis is worsening, and cities and towns in Ukraine are being destroyed. Even beyond Ukraine, hardly can we point to a country unaffected by the consequences of the war. Nigeria is committed to the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and international law. It abhors violations of the UN Charter. Despite continuation of aggression against Ukraine, Mr. President, members of this organization must prioritize ending this war. Thereafter, working towards sustainable peace between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Nigeria commends efforts of the Secretary General and the Republic of Turkey in ensuring supplies of grains to countries that needed them most and ensuring humanitarian access. We should deepen this approach by focusing on stopping the war, preventing further loss of lives and destruction of towns and cities, causing terrible displacement. Countries and entities that have influence on the two countries need to work with the United Nations to achieve this objective. We all have some responsibility in this. It is Nigeria's firm belief that the cause of peace in our world will be eminently enhanced if, among other things, we overcome the will to invade and occupy and the tendency to assume it right that some countries are merely security zones or zones of control by others. Our charter has guided us for so long, even with some of its structural limitations. Of all the elements of the charter of our organization, the most important ones are the principles of respect for sovereignty of states and the principle of peaceful settlement of disputes. While Nigeria strongly believes in the need to hold all parties accountable for the crimes committed, we register our reservation about OP9 of the text in the draft L7 principles of the Charter of the United Nations underline a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. The most urgent accountability is for us to see whatever resources other than violence at our disposal. We can use whatever resources at our disposal to guarantee that this war stops. Nigeria is not fully sure that OP9 is really helpful in stopping the war. It may harden positions and make getting a solution more difficult. In addition, not only are the mechanisms for the investigations and prosecutions unclear in the text, it's also not difficult to see how the Assembly will be bogged down for years to come over which aggressions by some member states should be treated in the same manner or which ones should be prioritized. It is in light of this and other considerations that Nigeria will vote in favor of the resolution but reserve on paragraph 9. We may well decide at an appropriate time to have a focused, honest, if difficult, discussion about accountability in all cases of unilateral action, occupation, and settlement against sovereign states, with a determination to make this end and achieve genuine reconciliation. The solidarity that we have seen in giving comfort to victims in Ukraine, Turkey, Syria, and Pakistan recently should give us hope that this is both necessary and possible. In conclusion, Mr. President, in line with the Charter of the United Nations and especially concerning the inviolability of borders and peaceful settlement of disputes, Nigeria will vote on this resolution while reserving OP9. Nigeria affirms what we all signed onto, and looking at the consequences of the war in Ukraine, on Ukrainians, on the rest of the world, urges focused attention first of the cessation of the war. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Nigeria. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nepal.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, my delegation is deeply distressed by a year-long conflict, death and devastation in Ukraine. It has posed an extreme danger to international peace and security. Untold are sorrows and ramifications of the conflict, be it death and devastation in Ukraine, disruption of global supply chain, food insecurity, and inflation worldwide. Peaceful coexistence, mutual respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-aggression, as enshrined in the United Nations Charter, are the fundamentals of Nepal's foreign policy. The United Nations Charter unequivocally stipulates that all member states shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other manner inconsistent with the purpose of the United Nations. Further, the Charter says all members shall settle their international disputes by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered. Mr. President, security and stability of one and all countries are founded on these very principles. Nepal's position has been clear from the very beginning of this conflict. Based on the foundation of UN Charter and international law, Nepal has stood for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine and the protection of its civilians. Nepal has clearly pronounced that no solution can arrive through hostilities and conflict. Mr. President, as provided by the United Nations Charter, dialogue and diplomacy are the tools for resolving disputes and differences. As a peace-loving country, Nepal reiterates its call for the immediate cessation of hostilities and the creation of conditions for dialogue and diplomacy. And we urge all the efforts by the parties in conflict, as well as the international community, should be channelized to create conditions for peace. The draft resolution on just peace in Ukraine is before us today. The draft could have articulated the primacy of negotiation and dialogue and created a condition of just and lasting peace in Ukraine, which we believe is the fundamental for achievement of the durable peace in Ukraine. Nevertheless, we believe the draft resolution is intended to protect the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of Ukraine and bring peace in Ukraine. In this context, with a firm belief in UN Charter and settlement of international disputes through peaceful means, my delegation will support the draft resolution that is before us. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Nepal. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Mr. President, South Africa continues to express its deep regret that the war in Ukraine, which tomorrow marks its first anniversary, continues to destroy innocent lives and critical infrastructure, as well as displacing millions. This is a war whose impact has resonated across the globe, affecting the livelihoods of the most vulnerable and heightening the current debilitating global food, fuel, and finance crisis. South Africa wishes to stress its unwavering belief in the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. We believe that sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states should be sacrosanct, and this also applies to Ukraine. Mr. President, we also affirm in our resolve that urgent actions are needed to end the war. However, it is a sad indictment of our efforts that we, as the international community, have been unable to come up with concrete proposals to create the conditions to do so. As South Africa has stated before in this assembly, diplomacy and dialogue is the only path that will lead to a sustainable and peaceful resolution of the conflict. Today, we consider yet another resolution on the war in Ukraine, which comes amidst an influx of arms to the region, perpetuating greater acts of violence and increased human suffering. This, together with the threat of nuclear war, makes peace seem less attainable. Over the last year, this Assembly has adopted a series of resolutions on Ukraine. As we have asked this Assembly before, are our ways and actions focused on the maintenance of peace or creating further divisions that make the attainment of immediate peace less likely? While we support the present resolution's focus on the principles of the Charter and international law, it certainly brings us no closer to laying the foundations for a durable peace and bringing an end to the devastation and destruction. What we need is a firm and unequivocal commitment to peace from all parties. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of South Africa. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Thailand.
Mr. President, Thailand reiterates our unequivocal adherence to the UN Charter, both in letter and spirit, as well as to international law as the non-arbitrary point of reference for standards of conduct of nations. Thailand upholds the people's rights to live in safety with their basic well-being as universal and non-negotiable. Humanitarian consideration must not be politicized and discriminatory. We urge the United Nations to dispense its best and most earnest effort in preventive diplomacy to safeguard these basic human rights around the world and not to become a part of the morality play that turns very complex situations into simple binaries of good and evil, followed by finger-pointing and condemnations. Utmost efforts should be carried out to create conducive environments for engagement and dialogues to settle disputes once they erupt, rather than adding fuel to the fire. The Hippocratic Oath should apply in all the UN endeavors. Quote, first, do no harm, unquote. On the one-year anniversary of war in Ukraine, we urge all members of this prestigious body to do the right thing by the world at large, and by the 8 billion people who are simply bystanders but are bearing the brunt of the war in very many different ways. For the peace settlement process to start, we must try to understand the root causes of the conflict in an objective and non-myopic manner, devoid of the power and morality play elements. The world is vast and rich enough for countries with diverse ideologies and political form of government to coexist peacefully if we learn to respect the differences and heed our respective existential. More weapons escalate fighting, more fighting worsens human suffering, more sanctions intensify human pain and have never led to regime change. Condemnations bear no positive weight on altering behavior or conducts. Thailand calls on all parties to step up the diplomatic effort to engage in dialogues to achieve a peaceful, negotiated settlement as an exit to the Ukraine conflict. The war in Ukraine represents an unprecedented and most dangerous challenge that threatens the geopolitical, financial, economic, security, and collective balance of the world at large. It was said diplomacy is the continuation of war by other means. Wars cannot be settled by deployment of more lethal weapons, not unless total destruction and human casualties are the only objectives and the only option available. Wars can only be settled by engagements and dialogues, by pragmatism, not ideology, and not by the winner-take-all mindset. As in Isaiah 1:18, it is now time for all nations to come and, quote, reason together, unquote. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Thailand. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Angola.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, the resolution that we are about to adopt is being discussed at a time when the conflict in Ukraine, over a period of more than 12 months, has claimed incalculable human lives and caused multiple losses of material goods. We consider document A/ES/11/L.7 to be progress in view of the fact that the international community is showing clear signs of support for the process of seeking a peaceful solution to the conflict and making efforts to bring the parties closer together for a lasting peace in the Eastern Europe region. On the other hand, as the United Nations General Assembly is the most representative body of our organization, we think it is important that the intergovernmental process is inclusive. It is therefore imperative that the document has everyone's contribution, enriching it so that we can have Ukraine and Russia coexisting peacefully, a more stable and strong region, and an increasingly peaceful world. Angola will abstain during the vote. We are of the opinion that operative paragraph 9 is not conducive to creating an environment conducive to the start of peaceful negotiations. We do not see difficulties with the other paragraphs. Republic of Angola defends the notion of accountability of crimes committed by any of the parties. However, we do not think this is the right time to have a paragraph in the resolution and not to undermine the Secretary General efforts and initiatives to promote a lasting and comprehensive peace between the two countries. Excellencies, we would like to reiterate that the Republic of Angola is on the opinion that the conflict resolution between Russia and Ukraine can only be resolved through dialogue, and therefore the General Assembly of the United Nations must maintain its interest in preserving the principles of peaceful coexistence among member states. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Angola. Now I offer the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Brazil has decided to vote in favor of the draft resolution before us because of the urgent need for this General Assembly to reaffirm its unwavering commitment to uphold the core principles of the UN Charter and international law, while underscoring the need to reach peace. We commend the facilitators for the inclusive negotiations. In our view, the most important element of the resolution is the call for the international community to redouble its efforts to achieve a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. We also appreciate the important humanitarian element of the resolution, including the call for full adherence of all parties to their obligations under international humanitarian law. All possible measures must be adopted to minimize the suffering of the civilian population. It is high time to start peace talks rather than fuel the conflict. Brazil considers the call for the cessation of hostilities in OP5 as an appeal to both sides to halt violence without preconditions. No alleged difficulties to implement our call to stop hostilities, as set forth in this paragraph, must be seen as an obstacle to start negotiations. This resolution must be construed as an important step to pave the way for peace. The conflict that started a year ago has imposed immense suffering on civilians. It also entailed a number of consequences for many countries, especially in the developing world, due to its impacts on food, fertilizer, and energy prices. The time has come to open space for dialogue and to begin reconstruction. Brazil stands ready to participate in the efforts for a lasting solution to this conflict. I thank you, Mr. President.
And I thank the distinguished representative of Brazil. And now I offer the floor to the distinguished representative of Malaysia.
Mr. President, Malaysia has been following closely the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. We are deeply concerned over the increase in civilian casualties and in the number of displaced persons, as well as the destruction of civilian infrastructure, which continues to this day. In any armed conflict, it is always the affected civilians, men, women, young and old, who suffer the most. As such, we urge all parties to fully comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. At the same time, Malaysia wishes to see an immediate end to hostilities and the start of peaceful negotiations. Malaysia believes that for meaningful dialogue and negotiations to start, all sides must take into consideration the legitimate security concerns of both Ukraine and Russia, given the complex geopolitical context. This must be addressed through dialogue and peaceful means in accordance with the principles of the UN Charter and the rule of law. Malaysia has and will continue to uphold the principles of respect for the sovereignty and the independence and territorial integrity of states. Staying faithful to these principles, Malaysia will vote in favor of this resolution. Mr. President, Malaysia regrets what we see as the inability or unwillingness of the Security Council to discharge its primary responsibility to maintain international peace and security. The General Assembly has adopted 6 resolutions related to the ongoing conflict, but the situation on the ground remains the same, if not worse. In this regard, Malaysia calls on all parties concerned to take immediate steps to de-escalate to prevent further loss of lives and destruction. Today, we have heard calls and appeals for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace by fellow delegates. Malaysia strongly echoes these calls and appeals. Mr. President, finally, Malaysia wishes to register our disappointment over the fact that there were no open-ended discussions with member states at large. We feel that there should be more open-ended consultations so that the larger membership of the UN would be able to engage with the pen holders in order to air their views, especially since this is the 6th resolution on the issue. Malaysia reiterates our commitment to the peaceful settlement of disputes guided by the principles enshrined in the UN Charter and under international law in the interest of maintaining regional and international peace and security. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Malaysia. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will be brief. Before we vote on the main resolution, allow me to address the amendments proposed by Belarus. They have been put forward by a state that has facilitated Russia's invasion, that provided the staging ground for the early attempt to topple Kyiv. And that is among a small number of states that have consistently voted against upholding Ukraine's rights under the UN Charter. The amendments attempt to create a false equivalence between Russia, which this General Assembly and the Secretary General have made clear is engaged in a full-scale invasion, and Ukraine, which is exercising its right of self-defense against that aggression. Put simply, these amendments are an attempt to undermine the Charter. They're not aimed at peace, but at defending the aggressor. They are not proposed in good faith. So we urge member states to vote against these amendments so we can move to vote in favour of the resolution that genuinely seeks a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine in line with the UN Charter. And I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom. Excellencies, we have heard the last speaker in explanation of vote before the vote. I wish to address the question concerning the majority required for the adoption of the draft resolution. In light of Article 18, paragraphs 2 and 3 of the Charter of the United Nations, is there any objection to taking action on draft resolution A/ES 11/L7 by a 2/3 majority of the members present and voting? I see none. The 2/3 majority of members present and voting is therefore required for the adoption of the draft resolution A/ES 11/L7. The 2/3 majority of members present and voting is therefore also required for the adoption of the draft amendments A/ES 11/L8 and A/ES 11/L9. Before proceeding to take a decision on draft resolution A/ES 11/L7, in accordance with the Rule 90 of the Rules of Procedure, the Assembly shall first take a decision on draft amendments A/ES 11/L8 and A/ES 11/L9, one by one. We first turn to draft amendment A/ES 11/L8. A recorded vote has been requested on draft amendment A/ES 11/L8. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of draft amendments A/ES 11/L8, please signify. Those against or abstentions.
The General Assembly is now voting on draft amendment A/ES 11/L8. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 11, against 94, abstentions 56. Draft amendment A/ES11/L8 is not adopted. We turn next to draft amendment A/ES11/L9. A recorded vote has been requested on draft amendment A/ES11/L9. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of draft amendment A/ES11/L9, please signify. Those against or abstentions.
The General Assembly is now voting on draft amendment A/ES11/L9. L9. Will all delegations confirm that the votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 15. Against, 91. Abstentions, 52. Draft amendment A/ES11/L9 is not adopted. Since draft amendments A/ES11/L8 and A/ES11/L9 were not adopted, we shall proceed to take a decision on the draft resolution A/ES11/L7. The Assembly will now take a decision on draft resolution A/ES11/L7 entitled, I quote, Principles of the Charter of the United Nations underlining a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine, end of quote. A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of draft resolution A/ES11/L7, please signify. Those against or abstentions.
The General Assembly is now voting on draft resolution A/ES11/L7, entitled Principles of the Charter of the United Nations underlying a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. Will all delegations confirm that the votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 141. Against, 7. Abstentions, 32. Draft resolution A/ES11/L7 is adopted. Before giving the floor to explanation of vote after the vote, may I remind delegations that explanation of vote are limited to 10 minutes and shall be made by delegations from their seats. Now I offer the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba.
Señor Presidente.
President, pursuant to our strong commitment to the Charter of the United Nations and international law, Cuba defends the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of states and self-determination of peoples. We oppose absolutely the threat or use of force and support the peaceful resolution of conflicts and disputes. Almost a year ago, before this General Assembly, we warned that history would call for responsibility from the government of the United States for the consequences of a military doctrine which is increasingly offensive in nature outside NATO borders and which threatens peace, security and stability internationally. In Ukraine today, rather than tensions decreasing, the confrontation is exacerbating on the ground through the increasing movement of weapons, aggressive rhetoric, and unilateral sanctions, which contribute to extending the conflict. Cuba abstained on the vote on draft resolution L7, deeming it not to contribute to dialogue or be propitious to dialogue or negotiation with the participation of all parties involved to reach true and lasting peace. Achieving that objective is urgent today. We cannot continue to stoke a conflict which every day causes deaths and wounded people and material damage. We reject any attempts in the future to manipulate this text as a legal basis to justify the possible creation of tribunals aimed at carrying out judgments at national or international level. The General Assembly has no mandate for that. Cuba will continue to tirelessly advocate for a diplomatic solution, which is constructive, serious and realistic to the current crisis in Ukraine through peaceful means and under international law, which guarantees the security and sovereignty of all, as well as peace and security on a regional and international level. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cuba. Before giving the floor to the next speaker, may I kindly ask delegates to tone down their conversations. Let's pay respect to all speakers equally. Thank you very much for your understanding. Now I offer the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank you for trying to reinstate order in the hall, sir. Sir, Egypt has voted in favor of the draft resolution submitted to the General Assembly within its firm commitment to the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, especially in terms of the peaceful settlement of international disputes and the respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of member states. This is resolutely reflected in Egypt's firm positions with regard to all international resolutions. Here, Egypt would like to confirm the following. First, today's vote coincides with the one-year anniversary of the outbreak of the crisis in Ukraine, whose repercussions, be they humanitarian or economic, have affected everyone and not simply the warring factions. Developing countries, especially, including Egypt, suffer directly because of the continuation of this crisis, a crisis that has affected the economies of developing states severely as a result of the negative impact it's had on food security and energy security and its disruption of supply chains. Unfortunately, Mr. President, the international community continues to be lax in addressing the economic and social challenges posed by this crisis to developing countries. It is also unfortunate that the international community has been lax in working together to arrive at an appropriate solution to the crisis. Egypt reaffirms the need to work immediately on resolving the Ukrainian crisis, and we would like to remind those in attendance of the genuine call that was made by Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi at the inauguration session of the COP27 Conference on Climate Change in Sharm el-Sheikh, where he called for the need to end the Ukrainian war and look for means to settle it. Egypt had hoped that the resolution adopted today would have proposed mechanisms to resolve the crisis and to launch serious and comprehensive negotiations with no preconditions to resolve this crisis. Egypt would like to urge all relevant international parties to actively search for the appropriate mechanism to expeditiously resume negotiations in a manner that would address the root of the crisis and would guarantee a response to the security concerns of all warring parties and would guarantee their national security in an equal and fair and sustainable manner. Egypt urges all parties, be they involved directly or indirectly, in the crisis to cease any escalation and to refrain from taking any measures that would prolong the crisis or exacerbate it. This aims to stop the bloodshed and the human suffering in the zone of conflict and would end the humanitarian impact of the crisis that has affected innocents in continents that are thousands of miles away from this conflict. In closing, Mr. President, Egypt hopes that this current crisis would serve as a reminder to everyone internationally of the need to stop using dual standards and double standards in dealing with similar situations in accordance with international law, because the use of such double standards would only lead to the erosion of international law and would topple the international structure in its entirety. Thank you. Dear President, I thank the distinguished representative of Egypt.
The distinguished representative of South Sudan.
Mr. President, South Sudan takes the floor in explanation of vote after the vote. South Sudan voted in favor of the resolution just adopted. Since the inception of the conflict a year ago, South Sudan has maintained and continuously cast an abstain vote. As a country that emerged from the longest civil war in the continent, and is implementing a peace agreement which many of you in this chamber helped to deliver, we joined to vote in favor of the draft with the singular reason that this conflict needs to stop. Its devastation has been experienced far and widely. Therefore, through our vote, we strongly call for a peaceful and speedy settlement through a negotiated mechanism agreed upon by the parties to the conflict. It is our considered belief that there is no military solution to the conflict than the destruction we have witnessed. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of South Sudan. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Indonesia.
Mr. President, 1 year after the war began in Ukraine, we are no closer to peace. Death, suffering, and destruction continues to mount. The impact of the war has gone beyond the borders of the countries in conflict. Indonesia voted in favor for the resolution because we believe upholding the principle of the UN Charter and international law, including peaceful resolution of dispute, respect for human rights, and the rule of law are fundamental to resolve the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Despite this, we deeply regret that critical elements which we constructively suggested in the drafting process are missing in the final draft. In this regard, we believe the resolution adopted today may not have achieved the intended goal, which is to help bring the countries at war closer to peace. The resolution is missing the spirit to realizing peace in Ukraine. Nor does the resolution call on the international community to create conditions conducive to ending the war. Most notably, the resolution is missing the call for the two parties in conflict to pursue dialogue, diplomatic means, and enter into direct peace negotiation. Ultimately, The two parties themselves are the ones that can and must prevent further downward spiral and end the war. We are also concerned that the resolution failed to avoid a zero-sum game approach to resolving the underlying problem. As such approach will only deepen the divide between the conflicting parties. Mr. President, the General Assembly is the most inclusive organ of the United Nations. Its resolution reflects the collective voice and statement of 193 members of the United Nations. It is therefore fundamental that its resolution be factually correct, accurate, inclusive, and balanced. GA resolutions are not social media content. The credibility of our august institution is put on the line if resolution put forward by the GA spins factual information. The resolution adopted today was leaning very close towards this direction. Mr. President, we must continue to work towards a world where aggression and violence have no place and where the principles of international law and human rights are respected. We must not apply double standards in addressing situations of conflicts in all parts of the world, whether that is the war in Ukraine, in Palestine, or any other part of the world. Indonesia stands ready to support all efforts towards peace and stability, and we call on the international community to do so. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Indonesia. Now I offer the floor to the distinguished representative of Lesotho.
Mr. President, Lesotho is taking the floor in explanation of position after the adoption of ESS Resolution A/ES/11L7 entitled UN Charter Principles Underlying a Comprehensive, Just, and Lasting Peace in Ukraine. We must always remember that we came together under the United Nations as peace-loving states, which accept the obligations contained in the UN Charter, and in the judgment of the organization, are able and willing to carry out these obligations. On everything we do, pursuance of international peace and stability should be our goal. Needless to mention that Article 2, subsection 3 enjoins all member states to settle their international disputes by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered. It is on this premise that Lesotho disassociates itself from preambular paragraph 7 and operative paragraph 5. The resolution clearly states the principles to be followed to achieve comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. However, the conflict in Ukraine shows no signs of abating. Lesotho firmly believes that respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence are, as enshrined in the United Nations Charter, are sacrosanct principles and should be respected and upheld by all member states at all times for the attainment of sustainable international peace. Therefore, Lesotho's vote was motivated by genuine desire for peace. The situation in Ukraine raises serious concerns with political, economic, and security ramifications for Europe and the rest of the world. The manner in which the resolution is framed further creates distance between warring parties and does not indicate any immediate steps for diplomatic solutions, as well as endeavors that would hasten a peaceful settlement of the conflict. Allow me to conclude, Mr. President, by reiterating that Lesotho would like to see the international community constructively supporting parties in their search for sustainable peace. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Lesotho. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of India.
Mr. President, India continues to remain concerned over the situation in Ukraine. The conflict has resulted in the loss of countless lives and misery, particularly for women, children, and the elderly, with millions becoming homeless and forced to seek shelter in neighboring countries. Reports of attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure are also deeply concerning. We have consistently advocated that no solution can ever be arrived at the cost of human lives. In this context, our Prime Minister's statement that this cannot be an era of war bears repetition. Escalation of hostilities and violence is in no one's interest. Instead, an urgent return to the path of dialogue and diplomacy is the way forward. Mr. President, India's approach to the Ukraine conflict will continue to be people-centric. We are providing both humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and economic support to some of our neighbors in the global south under economic distress, even as they stare at the escalating costs of food, of fuel, and fertilizers, which has been a consequential fallout of the ongoing conflict. Mr. President, the overall objective of today's resolution, seeking a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter, is understandable. We also note the emphasis on increasing support by member states for diplomatic efforts to achieve peace, as well as support for the Secretary General's efforts to promote a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. However, reports from the ground portray a complex scenario with the conflict intensifying on several fronts. Today, as the General Assembly marks a year of the Ukrainian conflict, it is important that we ask ourselves a few pertinent questions. Are we anywhere near a possible solution acceptable to both sides? Can any process that does not involve either of the two sides ever lead to a credible and meaningful solution? Has the UN system, and particularly its principal organ, the UN Security Council, based on a 1945 world construct, not been rendered ineffective to address contemporary challenges to global peace and security? Mr. President, India remains steadfastly committed to multilateralism and upholds the principles of the UN Charter. We will always call for dialogue and diplomacy as the only viable way out. While we take note of the stated objectives of today's resolution, given its inherent limitations in reaching our desired goal of securing lasting peace, we are constrained to abstain. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of India. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Pakistan has abstained on the draft resolution contained in document A/ES11/L7. I wish to explain the reasons for our vote. Pakistan is deeply concerned by the conflict in Ukraine, which has caused and is causing immense human suffering in Ukraine and massive damage to its infrastructure, economy, and society. We acknowledge the considerable effort made by the co-sponsors to moderate the tone and language of the draft resolution. Pakistan fully supports the resolution's call for respect for the principle of the sovereignty, sovereign equality, and territorial integrity of states, and non-acquisition of territory by the threat or use of force. States cannot be torn apart by the use of force. Pakistan regrets that these principles have not been universally applied and respected. For instance, in the situation of foreign occupation and the ongoing attempt at the illegal and forcible annexation of Jammu and Kashmir. Pakistan also endorses the resolution's call on member states and international organizations to redouble their support for diplomatic efforts to achieve a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. While the hostilities continue, there is an ever-present danger of a further military and geographical escalation of the war. There is thus an imminent threat to global peace and security. Mr. President, while my delegation agrees with and endorses the principles and general provisions contained in the draft resolution, there are some provisions which are not consistent with Pakistan's principled position on some of the elements covered in the resolution. As a country that has seen and suffered the consequences of prolonged conflict in our neighborhood, we attach highest priority to the immediate cessation of hostilities and the resumption of a dialogue to achieve a just and durable solution through direct or indirect negotiations, mediation, or other peaceful means. In this regard, we see an important role for the United Nations and the Secretary General, inter alia, under Chapter 6 and 8 of the UN Charter, for efforts aimed at de-escalation, renewed negotiations, and sustained dialogue for a peaceful diplomatic solution. Mr. President, consistent with our position on the draft resolution in document A/ES 11/L7, we have also abstained on the amendments proposed to the resolution by Belarus in documents A/ES 11/L8 and A/ES 11/L9. Mr. President, Pakistan continues to hope that in a constructive approach, the parties will soon accept a mutual and early cessation of hostilities. We also hope for the resumption of a dialogue for a durable resolution of the conflict based on the principles of the UN Charter and past agreements, and bearing in mind the legitimate security interests of all states. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Pakistan. Distinguished delegates, we have heard the last speaker in exponential vote after vote. In exercise of the right of reply has been requested. May I remind members that statements in the exercise of the right of reply are limited to 10 minutes for the first intervention and to 5 minutes for the second intervention, and should be made by delegations from their seats. I call on the representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. President, my delegation takes the floor to exercise the right of reply in response to the provocative statement made by South Korea yesterday. We categorically reject South Korea's outrageous outburst, which merits no comment. However, now that South Korea provoked us, let me make a few words. We reiterate that we have never recognized the unlawful UN Security Council sanctions resolution against the DPRK, which was cooked up by the United States and its vessel forces. We once again make clear that we have never had any arms dealings with Russia, and that we have no plan to do so in the future either. South Korea's reckless remark is intolerable, as it is totally aimed at trying to tarnish the image of the DPRK by fabricating a non-existent stuff. It is also a grave provocation that triggers counteraction. Clearly speaking, had the United States not infringed upon the just security interests of Russia and accelerated the eastward advance of NATO step by step, the present situation of Ukraine would not have been created. At the present, the US and other Western countries are wrecking the global peace and the regional security while handing over military hardware to Ukraine to the value of an astronomical sum of money in total disregard of Russia's security concerns. We would like to draw the attention of the member states to the fact that in January, the NATO Secretary General flew to South Korea to put pressure on the latter for its passive military support to Ukraine. It is also an open secret that South Korea is seeking to supply ammunition and weaponry to Ukraine in the face of the mounting pressure from the United States. It is a matter of time that military hardware of South Korea will turn up in the battlefields in Ukraine. South Korea's allegation is aimed at distracting the attention of the international community from its criminal record. We have already made it clear that we will not deal with South Korea. South Korea should be well aware that if it continues to provoke us groundlessly, it will face extreme security crisis, far from diffusing its security uneasiness. Taking this opportunity, we stress that The bravest Russian people have the will and capability to defend the security and territorial integrity of the country without any outside military support. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I call on the representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I am taking the floor today to say that India chooses this time not to respond to Pakistan's mischievous provocations. Our advice to the delegate of Pakistan is to refer to our numerous rights of reply that we have exercised in the past. Pakistan has only to look at itself and its own track record as a state that harbors and provides safe havens to terrorists and does so with impunity. Such uncalled for provocation is particularly regrettable and certainly misplaced at a time when, after 2 days of intense discussions, we have all agreed that the path of peace can be the only path forward to resolve conflict and discord. I thank you.
Thank you. I call on the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor. In exercise of my right of reply, we would like to make the following points. India continues to perpetrate a factually incorrect position on this forum year after year. Jammu and Kashmir is an internationally recognized disputed territory and not an integral part of India, as it has been claimed. Repeating a wrong position would not make it acceptable at any point. The focus of today's debate is on people and on the crisis that we face at hand. And one of the inalienable rights of the people enshrined in the very first article of the Charter is the right of self-determination. In the case of Kashmiri people, the right to self-determination has been recognized and promised to them by the UN Security Council through its resolutions. For over 7 decades, India has prevented the Kashmiris through force and fraud from exercising this right and holding the UN-supervised plebiscite to enable the Kashmiris to determine their destiny. India has imprisoned the entire Kashmiri leadership, illegally detained thousands of Kashmiri youth, including women and children, summarily executed young boys, put down protests violently, and burnt down entire neighborhoods and villages. Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir remains the most militarized zone in the world, where close to 900,000 security forces have been deployed by India to curb the legitimate struggle of the Kashmiri people. But such measures only serve to intensify the struggle of the people of Jammu and Kashmir for the right to self-determination, even in the face of worst atrocities as evident from thousands of unknown, unmarked mass graves in Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir. The innocent people of Jammu and Kashmir remain firm in their claim for their right to self-determination. Pakistan will keep exposing Indian brutalities and inform the international community of the plight of the Kashmiri people. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I call on the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation applied for a right of reply to make a few comments about DPRK's remarks. Let me be short but very clear. We believe each statement distracts the very reason why all of us are here together. It is about our desire for international peace and stability. It is about our respect for justice and international law. And it is about our commitment to the core principles and values of the United Nations Charter. My delegation believes all the representatives here know who is violating its duties under the UN Charter and international law. Needless to say, it is DPRK. We also would like to reaffirm that any arms trade with the DPRK constitutes a blatant violation of the UN Security Council resolutions. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I call on the representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea for the second intervention.
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor again. My delegation is compelled to take the floor to exercise the second of the right of reply in response to the statement by South Korea. we are not going to reiterate our position, but we take these opportunities to strongly condemn South Korea's attempt to incite a fratricidal confrontation in this August forum. And we condemn in the strongest terms that the Security Council is being transformed into a tool for implementing the hostile policy of the United States and South Korea and other vassal forces without mentioning a single word about the United States and South Korea joint military exercises now taking place in and around the Korean Peninsula, which seriously encroach upon the security interests of the DPRK. We seriously warn South Korea that if it continues to come up with baseless accusations in hot pursuit of its hostile policy against the DPRK, it will inevitably face greater security disaster. South Korea must bear in mind that continued submission to the United States will lead to its self-destruction. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. In accordance with the terms of paragraph 11 of the resolution just adopted, the 11th emergency special session of the General Assembly is temporarily adjourned. This meeting is adjourned.